Imagine standing in a courtroom, your voice shaking as you try to tell the truth, only to have the judge laugh at your appearance and dismiss your words before you even finish speaking. Picture being treated like garbage simply because you've fallen on hard times, while the very uniform you once wore with pride now hangs in tatters on your back. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of Marcus Thompson, a homeless veteran whose moment of truth came not on a battlefield overseas, but in a small-town courthouse where justice seemed reserved only for those who looked the part. What happened next would shake that courtroom to its very foundation and remind everyone present that heroes don't always wear suits and ties. Sometimes they wear the scars of service and carry the weight of sacrifice that most will never understand. And sometimes, when the world has forgotten them, the brotherhood they served with never does. The rain hammered against the cracked windows of the Riverside Community Courthouse, each drop echoing through the dimly lit hallways like the steady rhythm of marching boots. Outside, the October wind whipped through the bare branches of oak trees that had stood sentinel over this building for nearly a century. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed with an electric buzz that seemed to vibrate through the worn wooden benches and faded linoleum floors. Marcus Thompson sat in the back corner of Courtroom 3B, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap. At 52, he looked older than his years. Deep lines etched his face like a road map of hardship, and his silver-streaked beard was unkempt but clean. His clothes told a story that most preferred not to read, a faded army surplus jacket with patches barely hanging on by loose threads, jeans that had seen too many washes and not enough meals, and boots that had walked more miles on city streets than they ever had on military bases. The jacket bore the ghost of where rank insignia once proudly displayed his status as a master sergeant. Now, only faint outlines remained on the fabric, like shadows of a past life that felt simultaneously distant and immediate. On his left chest, a single ribbon still clung stubbornly to the material, the Purple Heart ribbon, its colors dulled with time and weather, but still unmistakably present to those who knew what to look for. Marcus kept his eyes down, studying the scuffed courthouse floor as if it held answers to questions he'd stopped asking years ago. Around him, the usual cast of courthouse regulars shuffled through their morning routines. Lawyers in pressed suits whispered urgently to clients. Court clerks shuffled papers with mechanical precision. The bailiff, a stocky man named Officer Reynolds, stood near the judge's bench with the kind of rigid posture that spoke of military training, though his soft middle suggested those days were long behind him. The case that brought Marcus here was simple enough, at least on paper. 3 weeks earlier, he had witnessed an assault outside the downtown library where he sometimes spent his afternoons reading military histories and staying warm. A young woman named Sarah Mitchell, barely 25 and fresh out of college, had been walking to her car when 3 men cornered her. What they thought would be an easy target turned complicated when Marcus intervened. He hadn't planned to get involved. After years on the streets, Marcus had learned that invisible was often synonymous with safe. But something about the fear in the young woman's eyes reminded him of his daughter Jessica, whom he hadn't seen in over 5 years. The protective instinct that had once made him an exemplary soldier kicked in before his survival instincts could stop it. The confrontation lasted less than 3 minutes. Marcus's military training, despite years of neglect and the fog of untreated trauma, remained sharp enough to de-escalate the situation without violence. The 3 attackers, realizing they'd picked a fight with someone who knew how to handle himself despite appearances, fled the scene. Sarah was unharmed but shaken, and she insisted on calling the police to report what had happened. Now, Marcus found himself subpoenaed as the key witness in the assault case. The defense attorney, a slick man named Bradley Hoffman, who wore his expensive suit like armor, had been trying to discredit Marcus's testimony from the moment he learned about the homeless veteran's involvement. Hoffman's strategy was transparent: paint Marcus as an unreliable witness whose addiction issues and mental health problems made his account questionable at best. The truth was more complicated. Marcus did struggle with alcohol, though he'd been sober for nearly 8 months. He did battle with PTSD and depression, conditions that went largely untreated due to his inability to navigate the veterans' affairs system while living on the streets. But his mind, when it came to details and observation, remained as sharp as it had been during his 3 tours in Afghanistan.
Judge Whitmore had a reputation in Riverside County. At 61, she was known for running an efficient courtroom with little patience for what she considered time wasters. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her black robes seemed to give her a sense of authority that she wielded like a weapon. She had been on the bench for nearly 15 years, and in that time she had developed a particular disdain for cases involving the homeless population. To Judge Whitmore, homeless individuals were a drain on the system, people who had made poor choices and now expected society to clean up their messes. She saw them as unreliable, often intoxicated, and generally unworthy of the court's time. This worldview had shaped her approach to cases like this one, where a homeless person's testimony was central to the proceedings. The irony was that Judge Whitmore came from a military family herself. Her father had been a career Navy officer, and she had grown up with a deep respect for those who served. But somewhere along the way, that respect had become compartmentalized. In her mind, there were real veterans, the ones who came home, got jobs, raised families, and contributed to society. And then there were the others, the ones who couldn't adapt, who let their service become an excuse for their failures. She had never made the connection between the trauma of combat and the struggles that many veterans faced upon returning home. To her, military service should have made someone stronger, more disciplined, more capable of handling life's challenges. The idea that war could break someone so completely that they ended up on the streets was foreign to her experience, and therefore not worthy of her consideration. As the morning wore on, Marcus watched the familiar dance of the justice system play out before him. Cases were called, plea bargains were negotiated, sentences were handed down with mechanical precision. The courthouse was a machine, and everyone in it, judges, lawyers, clerks, even the defendants, played their assigned roles with practiced efficiency. When his case was finally called, Marcus stood slowly, his knees protesting after sitting on the hard bench for hours. The courtroom fell into the kind of uncomfortable silence that often accompanied the presence of someone who didn't belong. He could feel eyes on him as he made his way to the witness stand, some curious, others dismissive, all aware that he was different from the usual parade of witnesses who appeared in Judge Whitmore's courtroom. The prosecutor, District Attorney Lisa Chang, was a competent woman in her late 30s who had prosecuted dozens of assault cases. She believed in justice, but she also understood the political realities of her position. A case that relied on the testimony of a homeless veteran was not ideal, but it was what she had to work with. She had met with Marcus twice before the trial, and both times she had been impressed with his attention to detail and his clear recollection of events. But she also knew that his appearance would work against him in front of Judge Whitmore. As Marcus approached the witness stand, Officer Reynolds administered the oath. Marcus placed his right hand on the worn Bible and raised his left hand, the simple gesture carrying more weight than anyone in the courtroom could possibly understand. He had taken oaths before, when he enlisted, when he re-enlisted, when he accepted each promotion. Each oath had meant something to him, a sacred promise to serve something greater than himself. "Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Judge Whitmore looked up from her paperwork for the first time since the case had been called, and Marcus saw the exact moment when her expression shifted from professional neutrality to barely concealed disdain. Her eyes took in his appearance with the kind of thorough assessment that left no doubt about her conclusions. The threadbare jacket, the unkempt beard, the nervous fidgeting with his hands, all of it added up to a predetermined judgment in her mind. "State your name for the record," D.A. Chang began, her voice professionally neutral but with an undercurrent of apprehension. "Marcus James Thompson," he replied, settling into the witness chair with the careful movements of someone whose body carried the accumulated damage of both combat and street life. "Mr. Thompson, can you tell the court where you currently reside?" This was the moment Marcus had been dreading, the moment when his credibility would be called into question before he even had a chance to tell his story. He straightened his shoulders, a ghost of military bearing asserting itself despite his circumstances. "I don't have a permanent address, Your Honor. I'm currently between housing situations." Judge Whitmore's eyebrows raised, and she made a note on the papers in front of her. Already, Marcus could see the wheels turning in her mind, the assumptions being made and filed away for future reference. The questioning continued, with D.A. Chang carefully walking Marcus through the events of that October afternoon. His responses were detailed and precise, delivered in the clear, economical language of a man trained to give accurate reports under pressure. He described the location, the time, the weather conditions, the appearance and behavior of both the victim and the attackers. His military training showed through despite his current circumstances, and for a moment it seemed like his testimony might carry the weight it deserved. But Judge Whitmore wasn't listening to the content of his words. She was watching his nervous gestures, the way he occasionally lost eye contact when discussing the more traumatic aspects of the confrontation, the slight tremor in his voice when he described the moment when he decided to intervene. To her, these were signs of unreliability, of someone whose mental state made him an untrustworthy witness.
The courtroom was dead silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers frozen over the keys as she processed what she was hearing. D.A. Chang sat with her mouth slightly open, stunned by the unprecedented nature of Judge Whitmore's comments. Defense attorney Hoffman tried to hide his smile, realizing that the judge was doing his job for him. But Marcus just sat there, absorbing the words like he had absorbed everything else life had thrown at him over the past 4 years. He felt the familiar numbness creeping in, the emotional shutdown that had become his default response to overwhelming stress. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice that sounded like his old sergeant major was telling him to stand up, to defend himself, to remind this judge that he had earned the right to be heard. But that voice was distant now, drowned out by years of defeat and disappointment. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Whitmore said, her voice now carrying a tone of dismissive finality, "you may step down. And I want you to understand that while you may have served your country at one time, that service does not make your current testimony any more credible than that of any other individual struggling with the same issues you face." As Marcus slowly rose from the witness chair, his legs unsteady beneath him, he caught sight of a figure in the back of the courtroom that made him stop in his tracks. Sitting in the last row, partially hidden by shadows, but unmistakably present, was a man in a crisp military uniform. The uniform was decorated with ribbons and insignia that Marcus recognized immediately, the kind of decorations that belonged to someone of very high rank. The man's face was stern, but familiar, and when their eyes met across the courtroom, Marcus felt something stir inside him that he hadn't felt in years. It was recognition, but more than that. It was the feeling of being seen by someone who understood not just what he had done, but what he had sacrificed to do it. The man in uniform made no move to speak or stand. He simply nodded once, a gesture so small that no one else in the courtroom noticed it. But to Marcus, that nod carried the weight of validation that Judge Whitmore's words had tried to strip away. As Marcus made his way back to his seat in the gallery, he felt the eyes of the courtroom following him. Most of those eyes carried pity. Some carried disdain, but the eyes that mattered most, the ones belonging to the uniformed figure in the back row, carried something else entirely. They carried respect. And in that moment, Marcus began to remember who he used to be. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The recess came 20 minutes after Marcus's testimony concluded, and the courtroom slowly emptied as people filed out for coffee and hushed conversations in the hallway. Marcus remained in his seat, unable to summon the energy to move. The weight of Judge Whitmore's words pressed down on him like a physical force, each syllable echoing in his mind with brutal clarity. Service to one's country is honorable, but it does not excuse a lifetime of poor choices and failed responsibilities. He closed his eyes and tried to push the voice away, but it merged with other voices from his past. Caseworkers who had dismissed his benefit claims, employers who had taken one look at his address and found reasons not to hire him, family members who had grown tired of his struggles and slowly faded from his life. The uniformed figure from the back of the courtroom was gone now. Marcus wondered if he had imagined him, if the stress of the morning had finally caused his mind to conjure up the kind of rescue fantasy that had sustained him through countless difficult nights. He wouldn't be the first homeless veteran to start seeing things that weren't there. But the nod had felt real. The recognition in those eyes had felt genuine. And somewhere deep in Marcus's memory, a face was trying to surface. Someone from his military past. Someone important. But the details remained frustratingly out of reach. D.A. Chang approached his bench during the recess. Her expression, a mixture of professional concern and barely contained frustration. She sat down beside him, keeping her voice low to avoid drawing attention from the few remaining court observers. "Marcus, I need you to know that what just happened in there was completely inappropriate," she began, her words carefully measured. "Judge Whitmore overstepped her bounds, and I'm going to file a formal complaint after this case concludes." Marcus looked at her with tired eyes. Will it matter? The question hung between them, heavy with the accumulated weight of a system that had failed him repeatedly. Chang wanted to offer reassurance, to promise that justice would prevail, but she had been a prosecutor long enough to understand the realities of courthouse politics. Judge Whitmore had tenure and political connections. A formal complaint might go on her record, but it was unlikely to result in any meaningful consequences. "She should matter," Chang said, finally, which was not the same as saying it would. Marcus nodded, appreciating her honesty if not her ability to change anything. He had learned to value truth over false comfort, even when the truth was painful. It was one of the few gifts his military service had given him that the streets hadn't been able to take away. "Tell me about Afghanistan," Chang said suddenly, shifting the conversation in a direction that surprised them both. "Not for the case, but just help me understand."
Marcus studied her face, looking for signs of the morbid curiosity that often accompanied such requests. Instead, he saw genuine interest, the kind of professional concern that good prosecutors developed for witnesses whose stories mattered to them personally. "Which tour?" he asked. "Whichever one you want to tell me about." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his mind sifting through memories that he usually kept locked away. The counselors at the VA, the few times he'd managed to access their services, had told him that talking about his experiences might help. But the people who asked were usually strangers who couldn't understand the context or they were fellow veterans who understood too well and carried their own burden of images too heavy to share. "Second tour," he said finally. "Helmand Province. We were running convoy security, making sure supplies got through to the forward operating bases. Dangerous work, but routine. Until October 15th, 2008. The date came out automatically, burned into his memory with the precision of a laser etching. Chang settled back in her seat, sensing that she was about to hear something important. IED took out the lead vehicle. Big one. Probably 50 pounds of explosives buried under the road. The blast threw our truck into a ditch, knocked me unconscious for maybe 30 seconds. When I came to, I could hear screaming. Marcus's hands began to shake slightly, and he gripped them together to maintain control. The courtroom around them seemed to fade as he spoke, replaced by the dusty, blood-soaked landscape of his memory. Private First Class David Chen was trapped under the overturned vehicle. 19 years old. Kid from San Francisco who wanted to be a teacher when he got out. The truck was on fire, and we had maybe 2 minutes before the fuel tank went up. The other guys in my unit were either unconscious or dealing with their own injuries. Chang found herself holding her breath, caught up in the quiet intensity of Marcus's recollection. I managed to crawl over to where Chen was trapped. His legs were pinned, and he was going into shock. The heat from the fire was getting worse, and I could smell gasoline everywhere. I had a choice to make. Marcus paused, his eyes focused on something far beyond the courthouse walls. Standard protocol said to wait for the combat engineers to arrive with proper equipment, but Chen didn't have that kind of time. So I wedged myself under that truck and used my body as a lever to lift it just enough for him to crawl out. Took about 45 seconds, but it felt like hours. "Did you get him out?" Chang asked softly. "Yeah." Chen made it. Spent 6 months recovering, but he made it home. Got married to his high school sweetheart and teaches 4th grade in Sacramento now. Sends me Christmas cards every year, though I don't know how he gets them to me on the streets. Marcus's voice carried a note of wonder, as if the continuing connection to his former soldier was one of the few miracles in his life. "What happened to you?" Truck exploded about 10 seconds after we cleared it. The blast wave threw me 15 feet and compressed 2 vertebrae in my lower back. Concussion, internal bleeding, second-degree burns on my arms and legs. Spent 3 weeks in a field hospital, then another month in Germany before they shipped me back to Walter Reed. Chang was quiet for a moment, processing the magnitude of what she had just heard. This man, sitting beside her, dismissed by Judge Whitmore as an unreliable vagrant, had risked his own life to save another soldier under the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. "Is that when you got the Purple Heart?" Marcus touched his chest unconsciously, feeling for the ribbon that still clung to his faded jacket. "Among other decorations. They don't mean much now." "They should," Chang said firmly. "They should mean everything." Marcus looked at her with the kind of tired smile that belonged to someone who had long ago stopped expecting the world to make sense. "Should doesn't pay rent or put food on the table. Should doesn't get you a job when you can't focus for more than 30 minutes at a time because every loud noise makes you think you're back in a war zone. Should doesn't help when you wake up screaming every night for 2 years and your wife decides she can't handle living with a stranger who looks like the man she married." The personal details spilled out of him with surprising ease, as if Chang's genuine interest had opened a valve that had been sealed shut for too long. He told her about the months of physical rehabilitation, the failed attempts to return to active duty, the medical discharge that came with a disability rating that wasn't quite high enough to live on, but was too high for most employers to overlook. He told her about coming home to a country that had largely moved on from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, where yellow ribbon bumper stickers had replaced actual support for veterans, and where "thank you for your service" had become a meaningless phrase that people said to absolve themselves of any deeper responsibility. He told her about his marriage falling apart, not for lack of love, but from the accumulated weight of trauma that neither he nor his wife knew how to address. About his daughter Jessica, who was 12 when he deployed for his third tour, and 20 when he finally admitted he couldn't be the father she deserved until he figured out how to be himself again.
He told her about the job interviews, where his military experience was seen as an asset until potential employers learned about his PTSD diagnosis, about the apartment applications that were denied because of gaps in his employment history, about the gradual slide from middle-class respectability to the margins of society, where survival became a daily struggle and dignity became a luxury he couldn't afford. The funny thing is, Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of bitter irony, is that I was good at being a soldier. Really good. My commanding officers used to say I had the kind of instincts you couldn't teach. I could read a situation, assess threats, make split-second decisions that kept people alive. But none of that translates to civilian life when you're competing with people who don't carry 20 pounds of invisible weight everywhere they go. Chang listened without interrupting, recognizing that Marcus needed to tell this story as much as she needed to hear it. As a prosecutor, she had worked with hundreds of veterans over the years, but most had managed to maintain some connection to the support systems that could help them navigate the transition back to civilian life. Marcus had fallen through every safety net, and his story illuminated the gaps in a system that was supposed to catch people like him. "How did you end up on the streets?" she asked when he paused. Marcus was quiet for a long time, his mind working through the sequence of events that had brought him to this point. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. It wasn't one thing, it was 1,000 small failures, each one making the next one more likely. I lost my job at a construction company because I had a panic attack when a piece of heavy machinery backfired. Sounded exactly like incoming mortar fire, and I hit the ground so hard I separated my shoulder. The foreman was sympathetic, but he couldn't have someone on his crew who might freeze up at a crucial moment. Couldn't the VA help? The VA is understaffed and overwhelmed. Getting an appointment takes months, and even then you're competing with thousands of other veterans who need the same services. I tried to work the system, but you need a permanent address to receive benefits, and you need benefits to maintain a permanent address. It's a catch-22 that's designed to keep people like me on the outside. Marcus described the gradual process of losing everything that had anchored his identity. First the job, then the apartment, then the car when he couldn't make payments. His wife had tried to help, but the financial stress combined with his untreated trauma had made him increasingly difficult to live with. The divorce wasn't acrimonious, they both knew it was necessary, but it severed his last connection to the life he had tried to build after the war. Jessica was in college by then. I didn't want her to see what I was becoming. Better to let her think her father was just absent than to let her watch him fall apart completely. Chang felt a tightness in her throat. The man sitting beside her wasn't the unreliable vagrant that Judge Whitmore had described. He was a casualty of war, as surely as if he had been wounded by enemy fire. The difference was that his wounds were invisible, and society decided that invisible wounds weren't worthy of the same respect as visible ones. The bailiff appeared at the courtroom door, signaling that recess was about to end. Chang gathered her papers, but Marcus remained seated, staring at his hands. "Marcus," she said gently, "you did the right thing by testifying today. What happened to Sarah Mitchell matters, and your account of what you witnessed could help ensure that her attackers face consequences for their actions." Marcus looked up at her, his eyes reflecting years of accumulated pain, but also a spark of something else, determination maybe, or the ghost of the soldier he used to be. "I know," he said simply. "That's why I'm here." As the courtroom began to fill again, Marcus caught sight of a familiar figure near the prosecutor's table. It was Sarah Mitchell, the young woman whose assault he had witnessed. She was talking quietly with the victim's advocate, her body language still showing signs of the trauma she had experienced. When she noticed Marcus looking in her direction, She offered a small, grateful smile that reminded him exactly why his testimony mattered. Judge Whitmore returned to the bench with her usual air of authority, apparently untroubled by the inappropriate comments she had made during the morning session. Defense attorney Hoffman looked pleased with himself, clearly believing that the judge's public dismissal of Marcus had effectively neutralized his testimony. But something had changed in the courtroom's atmosphere. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows seemed sharper, more focused. And in the gallery, Marcus noticed new faces, people who hadn't been there during the morning session. Most were unremarkable, but one figure in particular caught his attention. The uniformed man from earlier had returned, and this time he wasn't alone. 3 other men in military dress uniforms had taken seats in the back row, their presence subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Their ribbons and insignia suggested senior-ranking officers, the kind of men who commanded respect even in civilian settings. Marcus felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. A sense that he wasn't alone, that the brotherhood he had served with had somehow found him in this courthouse where his credibility had been systematically demolished.
Judge Whitmore called the court back to order, apparently oblivious to the new audience that had gathered to observe the remainder of the proceedings. But Marcus could feel their presence like a physical force, a reminder of who he had been and what he had accomplished before the world decided he was no longer worth listening to. The afternoon session was about to begin, and Marcus had the distinct feeling that something significant was about to happen. The afternoon session began with defense attorney Bradley Hoffman calling his first witness, Dr. Amanda Richards, a psychiatrist who specialized in trauma disorders, took the stand with the confident bearing of someone who had testified in dozens of similar cases. Her credentials were impeccable. Harvard Medical School, 15 years of clinical experience, author of 3 books on post-traumatic stress disorder. What the court didn't know was that Dr. Richards had never served in the military, had never treated a combat veteran for longer than 6 months, and had built her reputation largely on theoretical knowledge rather than practical experience with the kind of trauma that Marcus Thompson carried. Hoffman's strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than directly attacking Marcus's character, he would use expert testimony to suggest that anyone suffering from severe PTSD was inherently unreliable as a witness. It was a tactic that had worked successfully in previous cases, particularly with judges who were predisposed to view mental illness as a weakness rather than a legitimate medical condition. Dr. Richards, Hoffman began, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man who knew he was about to score points. In your professional opinion, how does post-traumatic stress disorder affect a person's ability to accurately perceive and recall events? Dr. Richards adjusted her glasses and launched into a clinical explanation that reduced Marcus's suffering to a series of medical terms and statistical probabilities. She spoke about hypervigilance, intrusive thoughts, memory fragmentation, and the tendency of PTSD sufferers to experience flashbacks that could distort their perception of reality. In cases involving severe combat trauma, patients often experience what we call dissociative episodes, where they mentally remove themselves from stressful situations. During these episodes, their ability to process and retain accurate information is significantly compromised. Marcus listened to her testimony with growing unease. Every word she spoke was technically accurate, but the clinical detachment in her voice reduced his lived experience to a collection of symptoms. She was describing his condition as if he were a malfunctioning machine, rather than a human being who had sacrificed his mental health in service to his country. Judge Whitmore leaned forward, clearly interested in what she was hearing. This was exactly the kind of expert testimony that would allow her to dismiss Marcus's account without appearing to be prejudiced against veterans. After all, she would simply be following the guidance of a respected medical professional. Dr. Richards, Hoffman began, continuing his systematic teardown of Marcus's credibility. If someone with severe PTSD witnessed a violent altercation, particularly one that might trigger memories of combat situations, how reliable would their testimony be?
Highly unreliable, Dr. Richards replied without hesitation. The stress of witnessing violence could easily trigger a dissociative episode or flashback, causing the individual to confuse present events with past trauma. They might honestly believe they're telling the truth, but their perception of what actually occurred would be severely compromised. In the gallery, Marcus noticed that the uniformed figures in the back row were listening intently to Dr. Richards' testimony. The senior-most officer, a man whose chest displayed an impressive array of ribbons and decorations, was taking notes in a small leather notebook. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his posture that suggested barely contained frustration. D.A. Chang rose for her cross-examination, and Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders. She understood that Dr. Richards' testimony was potentially devastating to her case, but she also knew that challenging a respected expert witness required careful preparation and precise questioning. "Dr. Richards," Chang began, her voice remaining professionally neutral but with an edge that suggested she was building towards something important. "How many combat veterans have you personally treated for PTSD?" The question was simple, but it went straight to the heart of Dr. Richards' credibility. She paused for a moment, clearly considering how to frame her answer. "I've treated dozens of patients with PTSD over the course of my career." "That's not what I asked," Chang pressed. "How many combat veterans specifically?" Another pause. "Approximately 15 to 20. And of those 15 to 20 combat veterans, how many were treated for longer than 6 months? Dr. Richards' confidence began to waver. "Well, treatment duration varies based on individual needs and circumstances. Please answer the question, doctor. How many?" "Perhaps 8 or 10? Chang consulted her notes, her voice remaining professionally neutral but with an edge that suggested she was building towards something important. "Dr. Richards, isn't it true that the longest you've ever treated a combat veteran was exactly 4 months and 2 weeks, and that this treatment ended when the patient decided to seek care elsewhere?" The objection from Hoffman came quickly, but Judge Whitmore allowed the question. Dr. Richards admitted that Chang's statement was accurate, and suddenly her expertise seemed far less impressive. "Doctor, have you ever served in the military?" "No, I have not." "Have you ever been in a combat situation?" "No." "Have you ever witnessed a violent crime?" "Not directly, no." Chang continued her methodical dismantling of Dr. Richards' credibility, revealing that most of her knowledge about combat trauma came from textbooks and conferences, rather than extended clinical experience with actual veterans. By the time she finished, Dr. Richards' testimony seemed hollow and academic, disconnected from the real-world experiences of the men and women she claimed to understand. But Judge Whitmore remained unconvinced. During a brief sidebar conference, she made it clear that she found Dr. Richards' testimony compelling, regardless of any limitations in her direct experience with combat veterans.
The next witness called by the defense was Officer Derek Mason, one of the first responders who had arrived at the scene after Marcus intervened in the assault. Mason was a veteran himself, 10 years in the Navy before joining the police force, and his testimony carried a different weight than Dr. Richards' clinical observations. Hoffman had coached Mason carefully, focusing on the inconsistencies in Marcus's behavior that might suggest mental instability. According to Mason's account, Marcus had seemed agitated and confused when police arrived, unable to provide a clear, linear account of what had occurred. "He kept jumping around in his story," Mason testified. "First he'd talk about the attack, then he'd mention something about Afghanistan. Then he'd go back to describing the perpetrators. It was like he couldn't keep his thoughts organized." What Mason didn't mention, and what Hoffman carefully avoided asking about, was that Marcus had also provided incredibly detailed and accurate descriptions of the attackers, including physical characteristics, clothing, and the specific sequence of events. These details had proven crucial in identifying and apprehending the suspects. D.A. Chang's cross-examination of Mason was more challenging than her questioning of Dr. Richards. Mason was credible, experienced, and genuinely believed his interpretation of Marcus's behavior. But Chang had done her homework, and she had found something interesting in Mason's background.
Officer Mason, you mentioned that you're a Navy veteran yourself. Thank you for your service. Mason nodded, clearly proud of his military background. During your time in the Navy, did you ever witness a fellow service member experiencing what you might call a stress reaction? Yes, on several occasions. Can you describe what that looked like? Mason described incidents he had witnessed during his deployment to the Persian Gulf, where sailors under extreme stress had exhibited symptoms of hypervigilance, rapid speech, and difficulty maintaining linear thought patterns. Officer Mason, Chang continued, would it be fair to say that what you observed in Mr. Thompson's behavior was consistent with someone who had just intervened in a violent situation and was experiencing an adrenaline response? Mason hesitated. Well, yes, that's possible. And isn't it true that individuals with combat experience often maintain heightened awareness even in stressful civilian situations, which might cause them to notice and remember details that others might miss? That could be accurate, yes. Chang was building a case that Marcus's military training and experience, rather than being a liability, might actually make him a more reliable witness than the average civilian. A combat veteran's heightened situational awareness and attention to detail could be assets rather than evidence of mental instability. But before she could fully develop this line of questioning, something unexpected happened. The courtroom's main doors opened with a soft creak, and a figure entered that caused every head to turn. The man who walked down the center aisle wore the dress blue uniform of the United States Army, but it was the silver stars on his shoulders that drew attention. 4 stars, indicating the rank of general. His bearing was unmistakably military, shoulders back, head high, eyes forward, and his chest displayed ribbons and decorations that spoke of a career spent in the most challenging and dangerous assignments the Army could offer. He was followed by 2 colonels and a major, all in dress uniform, all carrying themselves with the kind of quiet authority that comes from years of leadership in high-stakes situations. The small procession moved through the courtroom with purpose, taking seats in the front row of the gallery. Judge Whitmore paused in her management of the proceedings, clearly uncertain about how to respond to this unexpected development. The presence of such high-ranking military officials in her courtroom was unprecedented, and she had no protocol for dealing with it. The general, whose name tape read Harrison, made no attempt to disrupt the proceedings. He simply sat quietly, his attention focused on the witness stand where Officer Mason was still being cross-examined. But his presence changed everything. The air in the courtroom seemed to thicken with anticipation, as if everyone present sensed that something significant was about to occur. Marcus felt his chest tighten as he looked at the general's face. There was something familiar about those features, something that stirred memories from his time in Afghanistan. The general appeared to be in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that belonged to someone who had spent decades making life-and-death decisions. And then it hit him. General William Harrison, 4th Star, Commanding Officer of Joint Special Operations Command, the man who had personally pinned the silver star on Marcus's chest after the incident that had saved David Chin's life. Marcus hadn't seen Harrison in over 10 years, not since his final debriefing at Walter Reed Medical Center. At that time, Harrison was a 2-star general, but even then his reputation for taking care of his soldiers was legendary. He was known throughout the special operations community as an officer who never forgot the men and women who served under his command. The general's eyes found Marcus in the gallery, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. Harrison's expression remained neutral, professional, but Marcus caught the slight nod, the same gesture he had seen earlier in the morning, but now he understood its significance. General William Harrison knew exactly who Marcus Thompson was, and he had not forgotten the debt that the Army owed to the homeless veteran sitting in the back of a small-town courtroom. D.A. Chang noticed the subtle exchange and realized that the dynamic in the courtroom had fundamentally shifted. She had no idea who the general was or why he was there, but she could sense that his presence was connected to Marcus in some way. Judge Whitmore, meanwhile, was growing increasingly uncomfortable. The presence of high-ranking military officials suggested that this case had implications beyond her small courtroom, implications that she was not prepared to handle.
"Your Honor," she said during a brief recess, "I'm not sure how to proceed with these observers." The bailiff, Officer Reynolds, approached the bench. "Ma'am, the general asked to speak with you during the break. He says it's a matter of national importance." Judge Whitmore felt a chill run down her spine. National importance? This was supposed to be a simple assault case involving a homeless veteran and 3 local thugs. What could possibly be of national importance? But as she looked out at the uniformed figures in her courtroom, Judge Whitmore began to realize that she had made a terrible mistake. The homeless man she had publicly humiliated might not be who she thought he was. And if General Harrison was here, that meant someone very important had been paying attention to what happened in her courtroom that morning. The afternoon recess stretched longer than usual as behind-the-scenes conversations took place. Marcus remained in his seat, acutely aware that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. In the hallway outside the courtroom, General Harrison was having a quiet but intense conversation with D.A. Chang. The details of that conversation would remain private, but when they returned to the courtroom, Chang's entire demeanor had changed. She walked with new confidence, her shoulders set with determination. Judge Whitmore returned to the bench looking pale and shaken. Whatever General Harrison had told her during the break had clearly rattled her composure. The afternoon session was about to resume, and everyone in the courtroom could sense that the real drama was just beginning. When court reconvened after the extended recess, the atmosphere in courtroom 3B had transformed completely. Judge Whitmore took her seat with noticeably less confidence than she had displayed throughout the morning. Her hands trembled slightly as she shuffled through her papers, and she avoided making eye contact with the uniformed officers now occupying the front row. D.A. Chang rose from her table with renewed purpose. During the break, General Harrison had provided her with information that would fundamentally change the trajectory of this case. She now understood exactly who Marcus Thompson was, and more importantly, she understood the magnitude of Judge Whitmore's earlier misconduct. "Your Honor," Chang began, her voice carrying a new authority, "I would like to request permission to call a rebuttal witness." Defense Attorney Hoffman objected immediately. "Your Honor, the witness list was submitted weeks ago. The prosecution cannot simply add new witnesses in the middle of trial." Judge Whitmore looked uncomfortable, caught between standard legal procedure and the growing awareness that she was in uncharted territory. She glanced toward General Harrison, who remained impassive, but whose presence seemed to fill the entire courtroom. "I'll allow it," she said quietly, her voice lacking its earlier commanding tone. Chang nodded respectfully. "The prosecution calls General William Harrison to the stand." The announcement sent a ripple of shocked whispers through the gallery. Even the court reporter looked up from her stenograph machine with surprise. It was unprecedented for a 4-star general to testify in a local assault case, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary. General Harrison rose from his seat with the measured dignity of a man accustomed to high-stakes situations. He walked to the witness stand with perfect military bearing, his polished shoes clicking rhythmically on the courthouse floor. When Officer Reynolds approached with the Bible for the swearing-in ceremony, Harrison placed his right hand on the worn leather cover with the reverence of someone who understood the weight of oaths. "Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do," Harrison replied, his voice carrying the crisp articulation of a career military officer. As Harrison settled into the witness chair, Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. The man he had served under in Afghanistan looked older now,
his hair completely silver, his face marked by additional lines that spoke of the burdens of high command. But his eyes remained sharp and intelligent, the eyes of someone who had never forgotten the responsibilities that came with leadership. Chang approached the witness stand with careful deference. She understood that she was questioning one of the most senior officers in the United States Army, and that every word spoken would carry implications far beyond this courtroom. "Your Honor," Chang began, "could you please state your current position for the record?" "I am General William Harrison, United States Army, currently serving as Commanding General of the Joint Special Operations Command at Fort Bragg, North Carolina." The titles alone were enough to establish Harrison's credibility. JSOC was one of the most elite military organizations in the world, responsible for counterterrorism operations and special missions that rarely made it into public awareness. "General, are you familiar with the defendant's witness, Marcus Thompson?" Harrison turned his gaze towards Marcus, and for a moment the years seemed to fall away. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of unmistakable respect. "I am. Master Sergeant Marcus Thompson served under my command in Afghanistan from 2007 to 2009. He was one of the finest soldiers I have ever had the privilege to lead." The words hit the courtroom like a physical force. Judge Whitmore visibly flinched, and defense attorney Hoffman's confident expression crumbled. In the gallery, Sarah Mitchell leaned forward, finally understanding that the homeless man who had saved her was far more than he appeared. "General Harrison, can you describe Master Sergeant Thompson's service record?" Harrison consulted a folder he had brought with him, though he clearly didn't need to read from it to remember the details of Marcus's service. Master Sergeant Thompson completed 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan between 2007 and 2009. During that time, he participated in over 200 combat missions, primarily in support of Special Operations Forces, conducting high-value target operations and reconnaissance missions.
Harrison's voice took on the tone of an officer delivering a formal commendation as he continued. Sergeant Thompson's performance was exemplary in every respect. He was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action, 2 Bronze Star medals with V device for valor, the Purple Heart with Oak Leaf Cluster, and the Combat Infantryman Badge with Star. His actions directly resulted in the preservation of American lives on multiple occasions. Chang allowed the weight of those decorations to settle over the courtroom before asking her next question. "General, can you tell the court about the incident that resulted in Master Sergeant Thompson receiving the Silver Star?" Harrison's expression grew solemn as he recalled the events that had occurred over a decade earlier. On October 15, 2008, Master Sergeant Thompson's convoy was struck by a sophisticated improvised explosive device in Helmand Province. The lead vehicle was destroyed, and several soldiers were trapped under burning wreckage. Despite being injured himself in the initial blast, Sergeant Thompson single-handedly extracted Private First Class David Chen from beneath an overturned vehicle that was on fire and about to explode. Harrison paused, his eyes finding Marcus in the gallery. Sergeant Thompson placed his own body at risk to save another soldier's life. The vehicle exploded less than 15 seconds after he pulled Chen to safety. His actions that day exemplified the highest traditions of military service and personal courage under fire. The courtroom was completely silent as Harrison spoke. Even Judge Whitmore seemed transfixed by the account of heroism that stood in stark contrast to her earlier dismissal of Marcus as an unreliable vagrant. "General Harrison," Chang asked, "in your professional opinion, would Master Sergeant Thompson's military training and experience make him more reliable a witness to a violent incident than the average civilian?" Hoffman started to object, but Harrison was already answering. "Absolutely. Soldiers with Master Sergeant Thompson's level of training and experience are conditioned to observe, assess, and accurately report tactical situations under extreme stress. His ability to process information during a crisis situation would be far superior to that of most civilians." Chang nodded and then asked the question that would define the remainder of the proceedings. "General Harrison, what brings you to this courtroom today?" Harrison straightened his chair, his expression growing stern.
I became aware that a decorated veteran was being subjected to inappropriate treatment in these proceedings. Master Sergeant Thompson has given more to this country than most citizens will ever be asked to sacrifice. He deserves to be treated with the respect and dignity that his service has earned." The words were carefully chosen, but their meaning was unmistakable. General Harrison was serving notice that the military community was watching this case and that Marcus Thompson was under their protection. Chang sensed that she had achieved her primary objective and prepared to conclude her examination. But before she could speak, Judge Whitmore interrupted. "General Harrison," she said, her voice tentative, "I want to be clear that this court has the utmost respect for our veterans and their service to our country." Harrison turned to face the judge directly, and his expression was colder than Arctic steel. "Your Honor, with all due respect, the record of these proceedings suggests otherwise." The rebuke was delivered with military precision, and its impact was devastating. Judge Whitmore seemed to physically shrink in her chair, finally understanding the magnitude of her earlier misconduct. Defense Attorney Hoffman declined to cross-examine General Harrison, recognizing that any questions he might ask would only serve to further highlight his client's guilt and his own client's victim's heroic character. As Harrison returned to his seat in the gallery, he paused briefly beside Marcus. The exchange was wordless, but profound. An acknowledgement between two soldiers who had shared the brotherhood of combat and understood what it meant to serve something greater than themselves. Chang then requested permission to recall Marcus to the stand for additional testimony. Judge Whitmore, now thoroughly cowed by the presence of General Harrison and his entourage, granted the request without hesitation. Marcus approached the witness stand for the second time that day, but everything had changed. The man who had been dismissed as an unreliable vagrant was now revealed to be a decorated war hero whose service record spoke for itself. His posture was different now, straighter, more confident, as if General Harrison's presence had reminded him of who he really was beneath the accumulated weight of his struggles. "Master Sergeant Thompson," Chang began, deliberately using his military rank, "I want to give you an opportunity to provide additional details about what you witnessed on the afternoon of the assault." Marcus's testimony this time was delivered with the precision and clarity of a military briefing. He described the positions of all parties involved, the sequence of events, the specific threats made by the attackers, and the manner in which he had intervened. His account was detailed, organized, and completely consistent with his earlier testimony. But more than that, it was delivered with the quiet authority of a man who had faced far more dangerous situations and whose word had once been trusted with life and death decisions. When Chang finished her questioning, Defense Attorney Hoffman was faced with an impossible choice. He could attempt to cross-examine Marcus again, but doing so would only serve to highlight the contrast between the morning's humiliation and the afternoon's revelation. Any attack on Marcus's credibility would now appear to be an attack on a decorated war hero. Hoffman wisely declined to ask any questions. Judge Whitmore looked out over her courtroom, finally understanding the full scope of what had transpired. The homeless man she had publicly mocked was a Silver Star recipient who had risked his life to save fellow soldiers. The witness she had dismissed as unreliable was a master sergeant whose word had once been trusted by generals and whose observations had guided military operations. And worst of all, her inappropriate comments had been witnessed by some of the most senior officers in the United States Army. "The witness may step down," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. As Marcus returned to his seat, he caught sight of Sarah Mitchell in the gallery. The young woman whose assault he had witnessed was crying softly, finally understanding the full magnitude of what this homeless stranger had risked to protect her. When their eyes met, she mouthed the words, "Thank you," with a sincerity that carried more weight than any formal recognition. General Harrison rose from his seat and approached D.A. Chang's table. He spoke quietly to her for several moments and then walked to where Marcus was sitting. "Master Sergeant," he said, his voice carrying the formal tone of military protocol, "walk with me." Marcus stood and followed the general toward the courtroom's exit. As they walked past Judge Whitmore's bench, Harrison paused and looked up at her. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, I trust that the record of these proceedings will reflect the true character of the witness who appeared before your court today. It was not a request. It was an order, delivered by a 4-star general to a judge who had finally realized she was completely out of her depth. Judge Whitmore nodded wordlessly, knowing that her inappropriate conduct would likely become the subject of formal complaints and possibly judicial review. As Marcus walked out of the courtroom beside General Harrison, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the pride of wearing his service, even if that service was now carried in memory rather than uniform. Behind them, the courtroom slowly emptied, but the impact of what had occurred would resonate far beyond the walls of that small-town courthouse. Justice, it seemed, had finally arrived for Master Sergeant Marcus Thompson. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the steps where Marcus and General Harrison stood together. The crisp October air carried the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter, but for the first time in years, Marcus felt warmth spreading through his chest. It wasn't just the vindication of having his service recognized. It was the return of something he thought he had lost forever: his sense of dignity. General Harrison dismissed his aide with a subtle gesture, leaving the two men alone on the courthouse steps. For several moments, they stood in comfortable silence, watching the small-town traffic move slowly down Main Street. The courthouse behind them was emptying, but Marcus could see reporters beginning to gather, drawn by word that something extraordinary had happened in courtroom 3B. "Sergeant," Harrison said finally, using the informal address that marked their conversation as personal rather than official, "we need to talk." Marcus nodded, unsurprised. He had known from the moment he saw Harrison enter the courtroom that this encounter would extend beyond the trial. The general wasn't the type of officer who made dramatic gestures without having a larger plan in mind. "There's a coffee shop 2 blocks down," Marcus said. "It's quiet, and the owner is a veteran himself. He won't let anyone bother us." They walked in silence through the streets of Riverside, past the familiar landmarks that had defined Marcus's world for the past 4 years. The public library, where he spent cold afternoons. The park where he sometimes slept when the shelters were full. The alley behind Tony's Diner, where the owner, unbeknownst to most customers, left day-old sandwiches for the homeless population. It was strange, Marcus thought, to see his survival route through the eyes of someone who remembered him as a decorated soldier. For years, these streets had been a maze of necessity and shame. Now, walking beside General Harrison, they felt different. Not stages in a descent, but chapters in a longer story that wasn't finished yet. The coffee shop was indeed quiet, occupied only by a few students from the community college and an elderly man reading a newspaper in the corner. The owner, a former Marine named Eddie Rodriguez, recognized Marcus immediately and nodded respectfully when he saw Harrison's uniform. Eddie had served 2 tours in Iraq and understood military protocol well enough to give the 2 men privacy. They settled in a booth near the window, and Eddie waited until Harrison had brought their coffee before speaking. "I'm going to be direct with you, Marcus," Harrison began, his voice carrying the tone of a commanding officer rather than a sympathetic friend. "What I saw in that courtroom today was unacceptable. Not just the judge's behavior, but your situation. A decorated soldier doesn't belong on the streets regardless of what challenges he's facing." Marcus wrapped his hands around his coffee mug, feeling the warmth seep into his palms. "General, I appreciate what you did in there, but I'm not looking for charity. I've been offered help before, and it never—" "This isn't charity," Harrison interrupted. "This is the Army taking care of its own, which is something we should have done years ago when you left Walter Reed." Harrison reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder.
After I heard about what happened in that courtroom this morning, I had my staff pull your complete service record, all of it, including the classified operations that don't appear on your DD-214. Marcus felt his throat tighten. There were missions from his time in Afghanistan that he had never spoken about to anyone, operations that existed only in classified files and the memories of the men who had carried them out. You participated in 37 classified special operations missions, high-value target captures, reconnaissance behind enemy lines, direct action raids that disrupted terrorist networks and saved countless American lives. Your unit's success rate was 94%, the highest in theater during your deployment period.
Harrison pulled out a series of photographs, satellite images, and mission reports. Marcus recognized some of them immediately. The compound in Kandahar, where they had captured a Taliban bomb maker. The mountain cave complex where they had rescued 3 kidnapped aid workers. The midnight raid that had prevented a planned attack on the American embassy in Kabul. The intelligence you gathered during Operation Desert Viper directly led to the capture of 12 high-value targets and the disruption of a major terrorist cell, Harrison said. The mission report from your commanding officer recommended you for the Medal of Honor, but the operation was too classified to allow for public recognition. Marcus stared at the documents, memories flooding back with unexpected clarity. He had carried out those missions with the same dedication he had brought to everything else in his military career, never expecting recognition, never seeking glory. They had been simply what needed to be done. "Why are you showing me this?" Marcus asked quietly. "Because I want you to understand that your country hasn't forgotten what you did, even if the system failed you when you needed help the most." Harrison closed the folder and leaned forward. "But more importantly, I want you to remember who you are." Harrison's expression grew stern, taking on the aspect of a commanding officer delivering orders rather than suggestions. "Marcus, you've been living like a ghost of yourself for too long. Today proved that the man who saved David Chen is still in there, still capable of stepping up when it matters. But hiding on the streets isn't serving anyone, not you, not the other veterans who need someone to show them there's a way back, and not the country that still needs what you have to offer." Marcus felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. "What are you asking me to do?" "I'm offering you a chance to serve again, but in a different capacity." I pulled out another document, this one bearing the official letterhead of the Department of Veterans Affairs. There's a new program being launched called the Veteran Peer Support Initiative. We need experienced NCOs to work with homeless veterans, helping them navigate the system and access the services they need. Marcus read through the document carefully. The position would provide full-time employment, comprehensive health benefits, and most importantly, the opportunity to use his military experience to help other veterans who were facing the same challenges he had endured. "The pay isn't extraordinary," Harrison continued, "but it comes with housing assistance and immediate access to VA mental health services. More importantly, it comes with the chance to be part of the solution instead of just another casualty of a broken system." The offer was more than Marcus had dared to hope for, but years of disappointment had taught him to be cautious about opportunities that seemed too good to be true. "General, I appreciate this, but I need to be honest with you. I'm not the same soldier I was 10 years ago. The drinking, the PTSD, the time on the streets, all of that has left marks. I can't promise I won't struggle." Harrison's expression softened, showing a glimpse of the compassion that had made him legendary among the soldiers who served under his command. "Marcus, I'm not offering you this position because I think you're fixed. I'm offering it because I know you're a fighter.
The fact that you survived 4 years on the streets and still maintained enough integrity to testify truthfully in that courtroom tells me everything I need to know about your character." He paused, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "Besides, the veterans you'll be working with don't need someone who's perfect. They need someone who understands what they're going through because he's been there himself. Your struggles don't disqualify you for this work. They're exactly what makes you qualified for it." Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes for the first time in years. Not tears of despair or frustration, but tears of hope, an emotion he had almost forgotten how to feel. "When would I start?" "Immediately, if you're willing. There's a transition facility in Sacramento where you can live while you get back on your feet and begin your training. After 6 months, you'll be assigned to a permanent location based on where the need is greatest." Marcus looked out the window at the streets he had called home for 4 years. In the distance, he could see the courthouse where his life had changed that morning. The building no longer looked imposing. It looked like what it was supposed to be, a place where justice was served and truth was honored. "There's one condition," Harrison added. "You have to commit to getting the help you need. The program requires participation in counseling and, if necessary, treatment for addiction. This isn't just about giving you a job. It's about helping you reclaim your life." Marcus nodded without hesitation. The idea of getting professional help for his PTSD no longer felt like an admission of weakness. Today had reminded him that asking for support wasn't a sign of failure. It was a tactical decision made by someone who understood the importance of using all available resources to complete a mission. "I'll do it," he said simply. Harrison smiled, the first time Marcus had seen him show such emotion. "Understanding. I'll have the paperwork processed immediately, and we'll arrange transportation to Sacramento for tomorrow morning." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, drinking their coffee and watching the world continue its normal rhythm outside the window. Marcus felt a sense of peace settling over him that he hadn't experienced since before his first deployment to Afghanistan. "General," Marcus said finally, "why did you really come to that courtroom today? I know it wasn't just because of one homeless veteran in a small-town trial."
Harrison's expression grew thoughtful. "Because 22 veterans commit suicide every day in this country. Because too many good soldiers are falling through the cracks of a system that's supposed to catch them. And because sometimes it takes a moment like what happened in that courtroom to remind people that every homeless veteran on the street was once someone who raised their right hand and swore to defend this nation." Harrison finished his coffee and stood to leave. "What happened to you today shouldn't have been necessary, Marcus. But since it was necessary, I'm glad I could be there to remind everyone who you really are." As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Eddie Rodriguez approached their table. The former Marine's eyes were bright with emotion, and he extended his hand to Marcus. "Brother," he said simply, "I don't know what happened in that courthouse today, but I know it was something special. This coffee is on the house, and if you ever need anything at all, you know where to find me." Marcus shook Eddie's hand, feeling the solid grip of a fellow veteran who understood the bond that connected all who had served. It was a reminder that he hadn't been as alone as he thought, even during the darkest years on the streets. Outside, General Harrison's official car was waiting. Before getting in, Harrison turned to Marcus one final time. "Sergeant, I want you to remember something. Today wasn't about redemption. You never lost your honor, even when others couldn't see it. Today was about recognition, about the truth finally being heard by people who needed to hear it." Harrison paused, his voice taking on the formal tone of military protocol. "Master Sergeant Marcus Thompson, your service to your country has been exemplary, and your sacrifice has been noted. The Army is proud to call you one of our own, and we're honored to have you continue serving in a new capacity." It was as close to an official commendation as Harrison could offer outside of formal channels,
and Marcus understood the weight of those words. He stood at attention and rendered a crisp salute, feeling the muscle memory of military bearing return with surprising ease. Harrison returned the salute, and for a moment the years fell away completely. Marcus wasn't a homeless veteran or a struggling survivor. He was Master Sergeant Thompson, United States Army, decorated soldier and proven leader. As the general's car pulled away from the curb, Marcus stood alone on the sidewalk, watching the taillights disappear into the evening traffic. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and the hard work of rebuilding a life that had been interrupted by trauma and loss. But tonight, for the first time in 4 years, Marcus Thompson went to sleep knowing exactly who he was and where he belonged. And in a small courthouse in Riverside, California, the scales of justice had been balanced once more, reminding everyone present that true honor doesn't fade with time or circumstances. It endures in the hearts of those who have earned it through service and sacrifice. The homeless veteran who had been mocked and dismissed that morning was gone forever. In his place stood a man ready to serve again, not on distant battlefields, but in the communities where forgotten heroes were waiting for someone to show them the way home.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.